I am recording now. Okay, guys, any question, any comment today before we start? No questions, no comments. Just a quick reminder in case I don't have time at the end. Friday is a recorded session. Then we have spring break, which means that for a week, we are not going to have any contact, either live or asynchronously. So after today, we are going to see each other live again on Monday after spring break, which is fine. I'm just making sure that everybody is on the same page. And again, if I don't have time to say anything about this, I wish you have a nice, relaxing spring break next week. I hope you you also take advantage of the time to, well, if you can work, if you don't want to work, just relax, chill, do whatever you need to do to come back, re-energize, and ready for the last stretch of the spring semester. So anyway, so I don't see any questions on the chat. I don't see anybody raising their hands. So I am going to start by sharing my screen now. Okay. So on Monday, we start talking about contemporary trade policy. And basically what I said was that before getting into what's happening or what has happened in Latin America in terms of international trade and globalization, I think it is important to have a good idea of what trade policy means and where the theory is coming from, so that you understand why these ideas are so powerful and you know, have been adopted by, well, many countries, even when they are led by presidents and cabinets at the left of the political spectrum. So anyway, I am not going to repeat all these, but basically we went to through a quick historical recap to get to this idea of the HO theory, which is the leading international trade theory, which is based on the comparative advantage principle that goes back to Adam Smith and David Ricardo, division of labor, specialization, and we also talk about you know, how resources are more or less distributed around the world to see if the theory matches the evidence, and we saw that for the most part it does, although there is some inconsistencies that we can address later. But we also spoke about some theorems or corollaries that are based on the theory that have to do with price equalization, price of goods and services, but also the price of factors of production. So, I mean, the theory is very powerful because, again, the fundamental principle says that through international trade, production expands, grows, and therefore consumption can also expand. So everybody can benefit from international trade, but not only that, because of efficiency gains and because of reduction of production cost, and a more efficient allocation of resources, prices are supposed to go down and equalize across countries. And not only that, we also said that according to the theory, what is supposed to happen is that even in the absence of migration across countries, the price or the returns to the factors of production, capital for sure, but also labor should equalize, which, you know, it sounds kind of interesting because if you think about it, I think on Monday, I used the example of accountants. So accountants in the US thinking about NAFTA, you know, between Canada, Mexico, and the US, accountants in the US should be making the same amount of money of accountants in Mexico and in Canada, or engineers. But guess what? This, in principle, should also apply to farmers, right? For example, farmers. And I'm using this particular example because we know that has not been the case, particularly in the case of Mexico. And this, in part, explains some of the migration that we see from the South to the US, not just from Mexico, but other Central American countries, and at some extent, some South American countries. So the differences in salaries, even in the same occupations, is one of those factors explaining migration, farming in particular, that is impacting us here in the Valley. Let me let Cooper in. Okay, so this is where we left. So far, this is a quick summary. Any questions, any comments now that I kind of hopefully refresh your mind? All right. So this is new. Well, as I am presenting it, but hopefully you read this already. There are other benefits of international trade that in the typical rhetoric, the political discourse out there are used. And again, they are just to enhance the power of the benefits, potential benefits of international trade and trade integration. For example, some of the arguments say, okay, if you open to international trade, you're going to have much better access to technologies, to inputs of production. If you open to international trade, you're going to be able to take advantage of the economies of scale, because if you only produce for your domestic market, which is small relative to the size of the global market, well, guess what? Now you can produce as much as you can, driving down the average cost, and therefore increasing your profit margin and or increasing your ability to reduce price in global markets, making you a more competitive entity. So international trade is going to expand access to technology, to inputs of production, and also is going to expand your access to a larger number of consumers. But not only that, if you couple this international trade expansion with international finance openness, and you are going to invite the investment, you are going to welcome foreign direct investment in the form of multinational corporations, at the same time that you compete with domestic industries, you are going to be forcing domestic industries to become even more efficient, more competitive, because now you are in the big leagues. There is going to be a pressure to reduce price, to become more efficient, to allocate resources more efficiently. So this is a huge benefit according to the argument, because when you have a captive domestic market, you don't have to worry about a competition. You know that your consumers have to buy what you produce. They don't have an option. But if consumers have options out there, well, you better get your act together. Otherwise, you're going to be driven out of business. And also international trade, and I'm just reading my arrows here, can help to diversify the export base. So, thinking about the negative elements of the Dutch disease, well, when you think about expanding your trading partners, not just one country or one region, but many, and also thinking about the different taste and the different purchasing powers of different countries around the world, the idea is that you are able to hopefully also diversify what you produce, diversify your domestic industry. So, for example, in the case of Chile, that for many, many, many years, one of the problems with Chile was that, sort of a quasi-Dutch disease, was that Chile had been focusing on the production and export of copper. I believe Chile is the second largest producer of copper today in the world. But, when the fiber optic came, the price of copper went down and Chile was in huge troubles. So this is why Chile decided to move away from copper, or at least diversify, and they didn't abandon copper, because it's still today a huge source of income, but they start exporting fruit, timber, fisheries, I don't know if you have noticed, but if you go, for example, to I don't know, even Costco, you can find salmon from Chile, right? Or you can find sometimes fruit from Chile, not just grapes and wine, but other fruits as well. And the idea that they, something that they discovered that works really well for them is that because they are in the southern hemisphere, the seasons of the year are reversed. So when here in the US, we are not producing grapes because the temperature or the conditions don't allow it, well, in Chile, they are. So they can sell grapes to the US, or peaches or raspberries. And this is why when you go to the store, you find a lot of things from Chile in that we consider off season. Well, for Chile, they are totally in season. The case of Mexico is interesting as well, because they decided to move away as much as possible from oil. That was the problem for Mexico, oil. And they start investing in the so-called maquila industry, highly labor-intensive industries, typically located across the border with the US, producing, shoes, textiles, but also putting things together. So, for example, it's very common to see things that have changed lately, but in the early 2000s or late 1990s, the maquila industry across the border included factories where the US will ship all these components of a TV or a refrigerator, of a microwave, and Mexican workers will put all these things together that robots cannot do, doing this, or connecting wires or packaging or whatever, and they will send it back to the US. So that was the maquila industry. Let me let Dylan is in. So anyway, two more additional potential benefits of international trade. When you open your economy to trade internationally, many people consider this as a signal to the rest of the world that you understand what globalization means, that you understand that you are going to be, well, at least trying to get ready to compete in the big leagues, that you are going to be open to conversations for investment, for expansion, for all of these things that are part of the globalization era, right? So this is important in the minds of the investors' expectations, because they are more likely to go to, in this case, Latin American countries or any developing country, and make investments and pay attention to what's happening there, right? And as a consequence of this, that's the last one. If you think about exports, and once again, let me go back to the bucket, the balance of payments, remember? So the way that you make your reserves grow, your foreign exchange grow, is by increasing the amount of imports. Increasing the amount of exports. The more you sell to the rest of the world is going to be paying you in dollars, euros, Japanese yens, and the level of your reserves is supposed to grow. That's, in principle, what is supposed to happen. Yes, Cody, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so I had a question about the sort of diversifying the markets that these countries are participating in. It seems to be, maybe there's some other examples that don't sort of fit this mold, but it seems to be sort of a labor-intensive markets is what they can capture, because capital-intensive markets the barriers are too hard to overcome, because the countries and the multinational corporations aren't going to allow them to enter these markets that they've already established in. Mm-hmm. So isn't the only reason they can compete in these markets because they can sort of produce these things at a lower cost, because they can decide to just make labor costs be lower that maybe Western countries can't decide on, or sort of don't have the capacity to, based on sort of the laws that are already established?
Yes, that's a very good point, Cody. Thank you for the question. So, okay, you are bringing up two important points. One is barriers to entry. Absolutely. Many of these industries, high value added industries, technologically advanced type of, industries, have already an advantage because they are at the edge of technology. Many of these countries still rely on to produce fruits, timber, fisheries, and even the maquila industry in Mexico rely heavily on labor, on skilled labor. So they don't even need to invest in, high level education like college, or, they don't need engineers, scientists to do this, right? So yes, this is part of, what, dependency theory was complaining about, that the rules of the game are not necessarily favoring developing countries, particularly in Latin America. So these barriers to entry is one element. But another one, which in a way is part of the same element, is this, Cody. So I don't know if you're familiar with this, but the patent system, copyrights, is a very important, or can be a very important barrier to entry. So here in the US, we have the US patent system. And if you violate one of these laws by, copying somebody else, you're in troubles. But the jurisdiction of the US patent law only covers the US. This is why you have, places like in China and other places around the world copying a lot of things, everything from, purses from ladies like the Gucci bags, or Mont Blanc pens, very expensive pens, to many other things. So this is why the US, especially the US, but other European leading economies are pushing for some sort of supranational entity, supranational regulation that allows them to protect intellectual property. Because, especially some countries like I already mentioned, China, they are really good in what it's called reverse engineering. So they take a machine, put it apart, see how it works, and they are able to put it, to manufacture something that makes exactly the same thing, cheaper, faster, quieter, and they didn't have to invest any money in investigating how to develop this. So this has not happened, but if it does, if these countries are successful in launching and creating this structure where they can penalize countries for stealing intellectual property, internationally speaking, well, things are going to get even more difficult for Latin American countries because, right now, let's face it, many of these countries are taking advantage of this possibility. David, you unmute yourself. You want to add something?
Yeah, I want to see if you kind of look at it as almost a scale where countries are, you can say, like 1 through 10, and the US and developing countries are at 10, and third world countries are like at 2 or 3. The US had the luxury of taking each step going from 3 to 4 to 5, while the Latin American countries, they have a hard time going straight from 2 to 10. And even if they do take the next step up, they have all this competition from those already at 10.
Yes, that's a good point, David. Let me give you an example. So Mexico, let me pick one very clear example. Corn, C-O-R-N, corn, the Mexican staple in the diet for tortillas, tamales, and all that stuff. Corn is a native plant of Mexico. So you go to Mexico and you find hundreds of varieties of corn, yellow, white, purple, blue, red, anyway, small, big, hundreds of them, which is very rich, nutritionally speaking, is really good. The problem is that over time, when the US start investing in biotechnology for genetically modified seeds and many other things that, Mexicans cannot copy because access to this technology is extremely difficult, guess what? Mexico, from being a net exporter of corn, became a net importer of corn. Because now the American corn, which is white, bigger, nice, it looks nicer, and obviously cheaper. And of course, the yield per acre is huge relative to the yield per acre in Mexico. Now Mexicans have no choice but to buy American corn to feed the Mexican population, which, in the mind of Mexican people, this is crazy. How did that happen? So you are absolutely right, David. So for countries like the US, they can sell very sophisticated goods like cars and operating, equipment for medicine and construction equipment. But the US can also go down, in your scale example to 10, and they can sell primary goods as well, like corn to Mexico, like, many other things that the US produces, especially in places like here in the Valley. We're exporting almonds to China, we're exporting pistachios and peaches and cherries all over the world. Wait a second, but isn't that farming? Yes. And this is why diversifying your economy is so important, because you are not dependent on a particular sector. You are all across the range. And again, in your example, from 1 to 10, Latin American countries, they may be able to get from 10 to 9 to 8. But as they move up, the competition gets fiercer and more difficult to penetrate. So yeah, you hit the nail in the head, David. Yep. Cody, you still have your hand up. It's just an accident, or you want to follow up?
I can follow up. I was just about to lower it though. So wouldn't the argument be, or couldn't the argument be made that entering these supranational agreements with the US would be sort of counterproductive to the goals of Latin America? Because the US already dictates terms, sort of as you talked about with Mexico sort of becoming a net importer now. The US has the ability to sort of take over almost any market it wants to, since they're so labor intensive and the technological advantage they have is so high over Latin American countries. What would be the interest in for Latin American countries to enter this sort of agreement? Because it just seems sort of one-sided.
Okay, I saw your hand, Anton. Let me address this one, and I'll go back to your comment. Okay, so it's hard. This is a difficult question to answer, Cody. I don't want to vilify, demonize free trade. I think in principle makes sense. The problem is that it makes sense when two trading partners move from a no trade to trade position, starting from a more or less equal ground. So if you ask, let me give you an example of an athletic competition. So you have two runners, same age, same gender, same everything, except that one of them has been training for 3 years and the other one just started a week ago. You may be thinking, well, what's the problem? They are the same age. They have the same abilities. They have been eating the same stuff, whatever. But obviously, when you put it on the court to run, the one that has been training, that has the experience and the knowledge, more likely is going to defeat the other guy, right? So that's what I'm trying to say. When you are asking countries to compete against each other, it makes sense as long as they start from more or less the equal base. But the problem is that that's not the case. That's not the case. Latin American countries are way behind in technology, are way behind in, the know-how, are way behind in, administration, organization, management. All of these things, all of these ingredients are lacking. So when you put them to compete against a rich country like the US, obviously the US is going to win. And all of this lacking of resources and all of this list missing is not part of the theory. I mean, you know, in the when Adam Smith and David Rickard and all of these guys were thinking about this, you know, many of these things were not part of the equation, were not part of the mathematical models that later were developed by, you know, Samuelson and Stolper and all of these guys. So yes, in a way, you know, it's not necessarily a good thing. However, keep in mind that, you know, going back to my example, the only way for this guy in the athletic example to get better is to, well, force him or force her a little bit to compete. Okay, now you know what it takes. You need to start training. You need to start eating better. You need to start developing the technique. You need to start getting the shoes. You need to start getting all of these things. So hopefully you're going to start catching up. So another part of the answer, Cody, has to do with the attitude of many people in leadership in Latin America. You know, they are trying to appeal to the masses that, they're trying to appeal to the groups that hold power, not necessarily the masses of the population, because they are more influential in getting more votes. And, you know, and also the idea that they want to, they don't want to be left behind. They don't want to be left out of the globalization era. You know, they don't want to be, you know, sitting on the train station, just passing the train, you know, looking at the train passing by. So they no politician, you know, in their mind, they want to be accused of, hey, it was because of you. You know, you didn't let us jump into the train and the train has left and now it's going to be impossible to catch up. So many people in Latin America are making this argument that we need to figure out a way to insert Latin America into this globalization train, because if we don't, catching up later is going to be impossible. Yeah. Anton, I saw your hand before. Are you still want to make a comment?
Well, sort of. You've already kind of went over it, so I think I was gonna just keep in it. But it's the, it sounds like, or at least the way you explained it to me, is the two factors. First is the first to market advantage. That if you get to a market first, you begin to like lower your marginal cost or lower average cost, and then it's the, especially with any industry that has that can use capital, is developed countries are able to use their technology to defeat with the positive returns to scale. So even when they're not first, they can throw so much resources at it that they can evolve. So it's more or less just agreeing with everything you said.
Yes, Anton. Yeah, I think we are I think on the same page here. Okay, let me continue, and we can keep the conversation going. So what you have on the screen right now are the four main types of integration that we have seen around the world. So let me explain briefly each one of them. The most basic one is the free trade area. This is the typical example is NAFTA, what happened between Mexico and Canada and the US. This is an agreement with where all members are going to remove trade barriers among themselves, but individually, each country, Mexico, Canada, and the US, can keep any kind of barrier against other countries around the world. So Mexico may decide to welcome Japan, but the US may say, no, we don't. Or Canada may say, you know, we want to start, international trade agreements with Chile. With Chile or Uganda or whatever. Mexico said no. So that's the most basic trade integration level, if you will. The second level is a customs union. And this is different because now, in addition to removing the trade barrier, and by the way, when I speak about trade barriers, I'm talking about tariffs, subsidies, quotas. So the idea is that they are truly going to integrate through international trade. Anyway, customs union means that the members of the union are going to remove barriers between them or among them, but in addition, they are going to present a common front to the rest of the world. So if a particular country wants to invite another country, all members of the customs union must agree, because the relationship with that other country is not going to impact only a particular member that wants to do it, but every member of the customs union. So it's one level higher, right? And then you have another one, which is called a common market, which in addition to this, they are going to allow, this is very interesting, guys, full freedom of factor flows among themselves. Not just capital, meaning money, which obviously moves freely, you know, money doesn't need a passport, right? But in addition to capital, we're talking about labor too. So migration of labor can happen freely in a common market. And finally, a higher level is the economic union, which, you know, the most example, obviously, the only one we have, as far as I know, is the economic union is in Europe, where in addition to everything I've said in 1, 2, and 3, they also unify economic policies, monetary policy, fiscal policy, welfare policy. Pretty much every policy is the same. And of course, the idea is to move towards unity, which eventually developed into what we now know as the European Union, that in addition to being an economic union, have this monetary agreement, because they gave up their currency and they all have the, well, most of them have the euro. Although, of course, some countries are reluctant to do it, including, you know, the UK. From the beginning, they said, okay, we want to be members of the economic union, but we don't want to be members of the monetary treaty. So this is why they kept the British pound. But most countries said yes. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make with this slide, guys, is that if you think about NAFTA, and you think of NAFTA as a very high level type of international trade agreement, well, it's not. You know, it's like the baby step. It's like the beginning of what could eventually evolve into a customs union, a common market, and perhaps later a North American Union. I don't remember if I told you this story or not, but I think it was a few years ago, maybe 6, maybe 8 years ago. Did I talk to you about the Amero? Okay, I already talked about that. But anyway, this guy on the radio started talking about, you know, advising everybody to dump, to get rid of the dollars, Mexican pesos, and Canadian dollars, because there was conversations about creating something similar to Europe called the Amero. You know, instead of the euro, the Amero. Of course, that was nonsense. And you know, you can look this up online on YouTube and all that, because obviously we are way behind. You know, we are in the free trade area that President Trump just, you know, made a few changes here and there, but we are still way behind the rest of the world, at least certainly behind Europe. Norman, you had a question about this. I hope that clarifies. You don't have to speak. I'm just saying I remember that. Okay. Now, just to give you an idea, by the early 2000s, and I'm talking about 20 years ago, 50% of international trade transactions took place among blocks, B-L-O-C-S, blocks. So 50% of all goods and services moving across the world were happening in, you know, among countries that belong to any type of these levels of integration, either 1, 2, 3, or 4, right? And obviously, over time, this has grown even more, which tells you that it's probably, you know, not such a bad idea to consider joining one of these agreements, because if you don't, you're going to start feeling isolated, being left out. And this is the concept I was trying to explain before, when, you know, with my analogy of the globalization train. You want to get on the train before it leaves, because if you don't, by the time you try to get in the train, it's too late. It's too late. Now, I also want to make the distinction between block with C and block with CK, because it's totally the opposite. One letter can change the whole thing. So block with a C is one tool that countries, particularly powerful countries, have to, well, normally they do that in the name of freedom and liberty and democracy. So they are trying to choke the economy, another economy, by eliminating or diminishing significantly the flow of goods, services, and assets to that particular country. So they are literally trying to squeeze, all flows. You can imagine a hose or whatever. You squeeze so that food, services, foreign aid don't go to that particular country. Good examples are the Cuban embargo and the Nicaragua embargo, which again were imposed by the US, trying to choke the Cuban economy, for example, thinking that the domestic population were going to rebel against the leadership, and there's going to be a revolution, and that was going to bring the regime down. Of course, in Cuba, that didn't work. But anyway, Norma, yes, you have your hand up.
A question on what you're talking about. Now, say if a country does want to do that, and before the train left, they did want to get into one of these agreements, is it possible, and I'm pretty sure maybe it did happen, is that these countries did block them because they do maybe trade the same exports as they do, so lessen the competition?
I am sure that happened. But typically that happens when two more or less equal countries are trying to engage in some sort of trade agreement, because competition is going to bring the best and the brightest to the top. But if you have two countries that are starting at two different levels, like for example the US, I am sure they would love to start a conversation with any country around the world, because they are way up high. The potential benefits for countries that start up high are significantly higher than the potential benefits for those at the top. So this country in the top is very unlikely to block a lower ranked country. Does that make sense, Norma?
Yes, that's what I was getting at. If two countries were kind of at the same level, would one of them just kind of block the other one so they can get above water?
It's possible too. I mean, if there is some political rivalries, or in the case of Latin America, as we will discover later, there is some land disputes. So for reasons that go back to colonization, today in 2021, for example, there is territorial disputes between Peru and Ecuador, between Colombia and Venezuela. So there are many reasons for which two countries may say, okay, I don't like you very much as a trading partner. For example, the current case of Colombia and Venezuela is very interesting, because during the ongoing regime in Venezuela, which is not necessarily welcoming to enterprise, the private sector, free market economics, and low regulation, and all of these things, many industries left Venezuela. And because of Colombia and Venezuela are very similar in many respects, climate, the population, culturally speaking, most of these industries didn't have to go far. They just crossed the border, and now they are establishing business operations in Colombia. So Colombia is now in a boom, because they have the domestic industry plus the Venezuelan industry joining forces with them. And so in this particular case, it's not about trade necessarily. The partnership is more on the international finance, so you can think of multinational corporations, Venezuelan multinational corporations establishing operations in Colombia, right? I mean, so what I'm saying is that you may not see international trade taking place between Colombia and Venezuela, but you see a huge amount of resources, financial resources flowing between these two countries, and people too. I have many friends. I live in Venezuela for a few months in 1999, 2000. So I have lots of friends. One of my nieces is Venezuelan because my brother married a Venezuelan girl. Anyway, so I have a lot of connections in Venezuela, in Colombia. So anyway, I digress. I went side by anyway, I stop now. But yes, it's possible that blocking countries can be used as a tool, Norma, for sure. Okay, now, just to give you an idea, it doesn't matter, it didn't matter in the early 2000s and late 1990s when people in the new left start gaining positions, even though they have this mentality of dependency theory feeding into their policies and all that, they understood that becoming totally independent, isolated from the rest of the world was not a good idea, particularly the moderate left. The radical left is a different story, but most of the moderate left, they understood that. So in this table, you can see in blue, and this table is from the early 2000s. So this is not a current table, but that's on purpose. I want to show you this because in 2001, 2003, whatever, around those years, in blue, you have all these trade agreements taking place between or among Latin American countries. You can see Mexico, Nicaragua working on something, Mexico and Ecuador, Chile and Bolivia, and notice something interesting. Remember when we talk about North-South? Mexico was one of the few countries that decided to look north, and that's why Mexico joined NAFTA. But other countries, when they felt betrayed and they felt like, okay, we don't have a chance, let's start trying to figure out if we can join forces together. South, Bolivia and Chile, Costa Rica and Panama. That type of South in conversations. Unfortunately, we can dive deep into particular treaties, but again, historical reasons, political reasons, territorial disputes, the different size of the countries, the different makeup in the industries. Many of these trade agreements didn't bear much fruit. They didn't help very much for the reasons I explained, but also because notice they are free trade agreements, very rudimentary, very primitive type of trade agreements. The few customs unions here in red, you see this red, I didn't mean to move this, but anyway, you had a few, the Central American Common Market, which is very old, the Andean community, very old. So this is not new. This predates the new left. So when the new left presidents came on board, they tried to resurrect this, they tried to inject some energy, but it was too little, too late. Things didn't work very well. Just to give you an idea, Latin America, yes, they did embark in this liberalization process, this openness, particularly because they have no choice. In the 1980s with the Washington Consensus, that was one of the criteria, remember, one of the conditions. So it's very hard to see on this table, but this number right here, I'm using my pointer, is around 40, 32, and 38. So from 1985 to 1999, that's roughly speaking, 15 years, the average tariff level, and remember, this is a tax to imports, fell from 40% to 12.4%, which is a dramatic reduction. I mean, it may not look like much, but this is a dramatic reduction. So yes, Latin America start opening up. And of course, when they start opening up, they are going to be importing a lot more because the tariffs are going down, but also exports are going up because normally there is this reciprocity. So if Latin America is lowering the trade barriers, the trading partners are doing the same. So it's easier in principle to sell to the rest of the world because you don't have to face all these taxes that are tariffs. And yeah, you know, if you in blue, you have this in Latin America, this is the volume in billions of dollars. It more than tripled since 1980 to the year 2000. So the number of dollars in billions triple in terms of exports from Latin America to the rest of the world, which is huge. It's huge. Now, you have to take this with a grain of salt because if you look at the percentage of international trade as the global total, it's not much. You know, it jumped from 5.3% to 5.5%, which is not much. Particularly if you consider that you know, in the 1940s, Latin America had more than 12% as the global market share. Of course, later they closed down because of import substitution and all that. So, you know, relatively speaking, Latin America, even today, is still nowhere near where Latin America was in the 1940s, 1950s, before the dependency theory, before import substitution, industrialization took over. But certainly, Latin America has been in this quest to integrate the region to the, you know, to get Latin America into the train. I'm running out of time, guys. Okay, let me stop here just in case you have questions or comments. I can finish the rest of the material in the recorded version later today, and I'll post it for Friday. But you know, we have 2 minutes in case you have questions or comments. I don't want to start a whole new set of ideas.
I guess if we have 2 minutes left, I kind of want to add to Cody's question.
Yep.
And saying that the reason you wouldn't really jump on the train, I mean, you would be, do you really want to go against the US? Do you really want to steal their technology and make the US mad? So that's kind of like a reason, like, just because of the size of the US, you don't really go against them.
Yeah, well, it can be intimidating, that's for sure. Cody, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so I was trying to get at the point of that it's sort of a one-sided agreement in the US's favor, and that's why Latin American countries would, at least in my view, want to align themselves and not include the US in an agreement, because the US, even if they were to enter some supranational agreement, similar to like what you were talking about with the whole patent situation, the US is going to have control over that. At least a large portion of it. I mean, we see that in the World Bank and sort of the WTO now. So the only way that they're going to sort of lose any negotiating power, and I think a lot of literature sort of talks about this, is by establishing a trade bloc of small sort of countries that don't have a lot of bargaining power. You can improve your stance against sort of regional hegemons like the US or Germany and France and Europe, something like that.
Yeah, well, okay, let's briefly talk about this quickly. Trade integration in Latin America has been tried for many years and has not worked. We are going to explore this later, but the point I want to make here now is that, think about this. If you don't join forces with a major power, technologically, economically speaking, how are these countries going to be able to develop the technology to compete against the other big players? That's one key question, because the barriers to entry is not just for international trade, it's the barriers to entry to the technology, the technological improvement that these guys are way ahead. So that is a problem. And this is why many countries understand that, although it would be very nice to, you know, integrate regionally, South-South, and join forces and become of a certain size that you can face a big player, a big challenge for them is technology, right? We can come back to this argument later. I am out of time and I don't want to take away from your time, guys, but great questions. You have no idea how much I appreciate you guys so, being so engaged and participating. So I'm gonna stop now, stopping recording now.